The camping trip to Black Hollow Forest, the first sign that something was off, came before they even left town. Mara stood by the gas pump, staring at the distant line of trees that bordered the highway, her brows furrowed. Josh, her boyfriend, waved from the driver's seat, impatient to get going. But Mara couldn't shake the feeling that the woods looked darker than they should have in the mid-afternoon sun. They were headed to Black Hollow Forest, a secluded campsite miles from the nearest town. No cell service, no distractions. Just the two of them, and a weekend away from the noise. Josh loved this kind of isolation. Mara pretended to. It wasn't that she hated camping, it was the silence that unnerved her, the way the trees seemed to listen. By the time they reached the trailhead, the sun was dipping low, bleeding orange across the sky. The forest loomed ahead, the entrance flanked by two ancient oaks like gatekeepers. Josh adjusted his pack, grinned, and led the way in. Mara followed, the crunch of leaves beneath her boots, oddly loud in the growing stillness. They hiked for over an hour before reaching the clearing Josh had picked out, a circle of bare earth surrounded by towering pines. Mara noticed how the trees leaned inward slightly, as though closing in on the space. Josh was already unpacking, setting up the tent with practiced ease. By dusk, the fire crackled, casting long shadows. They ate in near silence, the isolation amplifying every crackle of the flames, every rustle in the underbrush. Mara glanced toward the dark wall of trees and thought she saw something shift just for a moment, but when she blinked, it was gone. Josh laughed softly. "You're jumpy tonight." She smiled, but it felt wrong. Why did the woods feel so expectant? As the fire burned low, they crawled into the tent, zipped it tight against the cold night air. Josh fell asleep quickly, his steady breathing a small comfort. But Mara lay awake, listening to the sounds outside. The wind in the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the faint crack of a branch snapping underfoot. At first, she told herself, it was just animals. Deer, maybe a raccoon. But the longer she listened, the more deliberate the sounds became. Too slow, too heavy. A faint scraping near the edge of the tent made her sit up, heart pounding. She held her breath, listening. Silence. Then something brushed against the fabric. She shook Josh awake, whispering his name urgently. He groaned, half asleep. "Probably just a raccoon," he mumbled. But Mara's eyes stayed wide, trained on the shadow outside. Eventually, the sounds stopped, but sleep never came. By morning, the forest seemed normal again. Sunlight streamed through the trees. Birds chirped cheerfully. Josh teased her for being spooked, but Mara couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching. They spent the day hiking, but the further they ventured, the more Mara noticed small things out of place. A tree marked with deep gouges, a ring of stones carefully arranged in a clearing. Josh shrugged them off, but Mara's unease grew. That night, the forest was too quiet. No wind, no rustling, just a heavy stillness pressing against the tent. Mara stayed awake again, listening. And then she heard it whispers, soft, indistinct, drifting through the trees like smoke. She strained to hear, but the words wouldn't come clear. She shook Josh again, but this time he wouldn't wake. The whispers grew louder. Mara unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The fire was nearly dead, but in the faint glow she saw shapes, figures between the trees. Not animals, people, but they didn't move naturally. Their heads twitched, bodies swaying unnaturally. Panic rose in her throat as one of them turned sharply, as if sensing her gaze. Empty eye sockets, a mouth stretched impossibly wide. Mara zipped the tent shut, shaking Josh harder, but he remained limp, unresponsive. The whispers crept closer, circling the tent like a tide. And then, just before dawn, they stopped. Josh woke to find Mara gone, her pack still there, her boots at the tent door, but no sign of her, just the faint sound of whispers, carried away on the morning breeze. And deep in the woods, the trees leaned in just a little closer. Josh called for Mara, his voice echoing hollowly between the trees. But there was no reply, only the rustling of leaves, as if the forest itself whispered back. He checked the clearing, circled the fire pit, his heart racing faster with each unanswered shout. Her footprints led a few paces from the tent, then stopped abruptly, as though she had simply vanished. No signs of a struggle, no trail. As the sun climbed higher, the woods felt tighter, the shadows thicker despite the light. Josh swore he heard faint murmurs drifting from deeper in the forest, just beyond where the trees grew too close together, where the ground dipped into darkness. Every instinct screamed at him to stay in the clearing, to wait, but the silence pressed in, suffocating. He grabbed his pack and followed the direction the footprints had pointed, each step feeling heavier than the last. An hour passed. Maybe more. Time didn't seem to move right anymore. The deeper Josh went, the more the forest seemed to twist, the trees warping, leaning unnaturally toward each other. He stopped when he saw it. Another ring of stones, identical to the one they'd found yesterday. But this time, inside the circle lay Mara's scarf, coiled neatly, untouched. The whispers returned closer now. Josh stood frozen, eyes locked on the scarf, his breath shallow as the whispers circled him like wind through dead leaves. He crouched, reaching for it, but something in the pit of his stomach warned him not to touch it as if it didn't belong to Mara anymore. The air thickened, carrying a faint metallic scent, sharp and unnatural. Behind him, twigs snapped slowly, deliberately. He spun, but the woods were empty. The deeper into the forest he ventured, the more disoriented he became. The trees grew closer, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead, choking out the sunlight until only dim slivers reached the ground. Shapes flickered at the edges of his vision, never solid enough to be sure. His thoughts turned sluggish, his footsteps unsure. Each breath felt harder to take, as though the air itself resisted his presence. Then he stumbled into another clearing, identical to the last, with another perfect ring of stones. At its center sat Mara's boot, upright, laces neatly tied, untouched by dirt or time. The whispers pressed in again, louder, angrier, circling faster, speaking in a language Josh couldn't understand, but felt deep in his bones. He called her name one last time, but the forest swallowed his voice whole. And behind him, the shadows began to move. Josh backed away, his pulse pounding in his ears as the shadows coiled at the edges of the clearing, their forms flickering like smoke caught in wind. The air grew colder with each step, the ground beneath his boots softening, as though the forest itself was shifting beneath him. His eyes darted between the trees, but every direction looked the same, dark, dense, unfamiliar. He turned in circles, trying to orient himself, but the more he spun, the tighter the trees seemed to close in. The whispers rose to a deafening hiss, and Josh felt something brush against his shoulder. He spun, fists clenched, but there was nothing, only the suffocating closeness of the woods and the sensation of being watched. His breath came fast and shallow, each inhale tasting of earth and rot. Desperation clawed at him. He had to get out. He turned and ran, pushing through the undergrowth, branches tearing at his clothes, scraping his skin. But the forest twisted around him, leading him back, always back. Finally, he burst into another clearing, his chest heaving, sweat chilling on his skin. At the center, the stones formed yet another perfect circle, but this time there was no scarf, No boot, only a single footprint pressed into the dirt. His own. Fresh. The whispers fell silent. And for the first time, Josh understood. The forest had never wanted Mara. It wanted him. Josh stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the stone ring, almost sending him sprawling. The realization tightened in his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. His mind raced, trying to reason with what he saw, but reason felt useless here. The forest wasn't just playing. Trixit was alive, bending space, reshaping paths, drawing him deeper. The circle of stones wasn't a marker. It was a trap. He turned sharply, refusing to stand still, and plunged back into the trees, not knowing if there was a right way out, but unwilling to give up. His feet pounded the earth, dodging roots and low-hanging branches, but every few yards the path shifted. Once clear trails looped back on themselves, trees rearranged into impossible patterns. His breath came ragged, panic close behind. He forced himself to stop, slamming a hand against a rough tree trunk, the bark biting into his skin. The whispers returned this time softer, almost soothing, weaving through the leaves like a lullaby. But beneath the sweetness, there was hunger. Josh squeezed his eyes shut, hands clenching into fists, willing himself not to listen, not to believe. But the voices spoke of safety, of rest, promising he could sleep, just for a while. He shook his head violently and pushed forward, deeper into the maze. As he walked, the forest darkened unnaturally, the afternoon light swallowed by the dense canopy. His surroundings blurred the trees, blending into walls of darkness, the ground fading into shadow. Time unraveled here. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into moments. The heartbeat beneath the earth returned, steady and patient. Josh stopped when he heard it faint, but clear. Mara's voice, calling his name, soft, pleading, from somewhere just ahead. He sprinted toward the sound, hope burning through his fear. Branches lashed at him, drawing blood, but he didn't slow. He broke through another wall of undergrowth into a clearing bathed in faint light. And there she stood. Mara faced away from him, her posture too still, too rigid. Her hair hung limp over her shoulders, her arms at her sides. He called her name, voice breaking, but she didn't turn. He stepped closer, something inside him urging caution. When he reached out to touch her shoulder, her head snapped around his hollow, mouth stretched into a grin too wide for her face. And the voice that came from her lips wasn't hers. You came back. Josh recoiled, stumbling, falling backward into the dirt. Mara's form flickered, shadows rippling beneath her skin like worms. The whispering chorus grew louder, the ground vibrating beneath him. She took a step forward, head tilting unnaturally to one side. Her grin never faltered. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not daring to look back. The forest blurred past him again, the trees growing impossibly tall, their tops lost in darkness. His lungs burned, legs trembling, but fear drove him faster. The whispers shifted no longer words, but shrieks, echoing between the trunks, chasing him. He burst into yet another clearing, and the air felt colder here. In the center stood a single tree, its bark slick with something dark, pulsing faintly beneath its surface. Josh stumbled toward the tree, desperation gnawing at his senses. It felt Roman natural, but his instincts screamed that this was the center, the heart of whatever the forest was. The whispers converged, circling the clearing, daring him closer. His hand trembled as he reached for the bark. The tree's surface pulsed beneath his fingers, warm like flesh. Images slammed into his mind faces, twisted in agony. People trapped beneath the earth, their souls stitched into the roots. Mara's face appeared, contorted, eyes pleading for release. He jerked his hand back, gasping, but the ground beneath him trembled, splitting open in a jagged line. Shadows spilled out, crawling toward him. Josh fell to his knees, clutching his head as the voices screamed louder, tearing at his thoughts, shredding his sense of reality. The tree's heartbeat thudded faster now, matching the panic in his chest. The clearing spun, the ground opening wider, threatening to swallow him whole. Through the chaos, one thought remained. There was no way out. But as the darkness crept up his legs, pulling him down, a faint sliver of light flickered across the clearing just, like the crack he'd seen before. He reached for it, clawing at the ground, dragging himself forward, inch by inch. The shadows screamed in protest, grasping at his arms, pulling at his mind. But he didn't stop. With one final effort, Josh threw himself into the crack of light, and the forest fell silent. Josh awoke sprawled on cool, damp earth, the scent of pine and rain thick in the air. His body ached, every muscle trembling as though he'd been running for days. The sky above him was pale grey, the forest around him silent, but ordinary no warped trees, no pulsing shadows. He sat up slowly, eyes scanning the clearing. There, beside him, lay his backpack, untouched, as though none of it had happened. But something in the air felt off too still, too clean, like the world held its breath. Josh rose shakily, calling Mara's name, his voice echoing through the quiet woods. No answer. He staggered toward the trail they'd taken days before, recognizing landmarks that now seemed distant, foreign. The forest felt smaller, as if whatever had stretched it, warped it, had retreated beneath the surface. As he broke through the tree line and reached the trailhead, he glanced back one last time. The woods stood silent, unmoving. But deep beneath the trees, just barely audible on the breeze, he swore he heard them again, the whispers, faint, waiting. And as he turned away, the forest seemed to lean in just a little closer. Josh trudged down the trail, each step heavier than the last, exhaustion wrapping around his limbs like lead. The further he moved from the campsite, the more surreal it felt, as if the experience had been some fever dream. But the ache in his legs, the scratches on his arms, the faint traces of blood on his hands told a different story. His mind replayed the distorted image of Mara, her wide grin, the voice that wasn't hers. The memory gnawed at him, twisting inside his gut. When he finally reached his car, parked alone at the trailhead, relief washed over him in a weak, hollow wave. He fumbled for his keys, hands shaking as though they belonged to someone else. Sliding into the driver's seat, he locked the doors immediately, though the action felt useless out here. The silence beyond the windshield pressed in on him again. For a long moment he sat there, unmoving, staring at the dense line of trees. He didn't remember starting the engine, but the car rumbled to life beneath him. The hum of the motor was the first familiar sound he'd heard in what felt like forever. As he pulled onto the gravel road, the forest flanked him on both sides, its towering trees seeming to lean inward, following. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror more than once, convinced the shadows were shifting just out of sight. 20 minutes passed before he finally saw the familiar wooden sign marking the edge of Black Hollow Forest. Relief should have come with that, but instead, a cold dread settled deeper into his chest. He hadn't escaped. The forest had let him go. A temporary reprieve, nothing more. His grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. By the time he reached the nearest gas station, the afternoon sun had burned away the mist, casting long shadows across the pavement. He parked beside the pumps, staring blankly out at the fields beyond, hands trembling as they hovered over the ignition. He couldn't make himself get out, couldn't face the world beyond this moment. The whispers might have faded, but they hadn't left him. Finally, he stumbled inside the gas station, blinking beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The cashier glanced up, a bored nod in greeting, oblivious to the storm raging inside Josh's mind. He poured himself a coffee, hands still trembling, and caught sight of himself in the cooler's reflection. His eyes looked hollow, darker, the edges of his vision feeling too narrow. His reflection felt almost unfamiliar. The thought occurred to him he should call someone. The police, maybe. Report Mara missing. But the words caught in his throat before they could form. How could he explain what had happened? How could he describe the things he'd seen? They wouldn't believe him. He barely believed himself. Instead, he climbed back into his car, gripping the steering wheel until his hands hurt. His heart raced, chest tight, the feeling that the forest still held a thread tied to him, refusing to loosen. Even now, miles away, the faintest echo of a heartbeat thrummed beneath his skin. It wasn't over. It never would be. As the sun began to set, the trees in the distance seemed to blur, their edges softening into something darker, more fluid. Josh closed his eyes, but behind his lids he saw the clearing again, the circle of stones, the shadows slithering beneath the earth, and Mara's face, flickering like static, her eyes pleading before they were gone. He opened his eyes to the empty road ahead, unsure which version of the world he belonged to now. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the weight in his chest didn't lift. His house, once a place of safety, felt distant, cold. He locked the doors, pulled the curtains tight, checked every window twice. But no lock, no wall could keep out the feeling that followed him, like a hand brushing the back of his neck. At night, when the world fell silent, he could still hear it, the faint whisper of the forest calling him back. Josh sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor as the minutes ticked by. His hands trembled uncontrollably, the events of the forest looping in his mind like a broken reel. The house felt too big, too empty, the silence inside matching the suffocating quiet of Black Hollow. Every creak in the walls, every groan of the settling house made him flinch, his heart racing. He tried turning on the TV, letting noise fill the space, but it only made the silence feel louder beneath. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time he closed his eyes, Mara's face appeared, sometimes pleading, sometimes twisted in that unnatural grin. He'd jolt awake, gasping for breath, covered in sweat. The darkness of his bedroom felt thicker, like the forest's shadows had followed him home, curling into the corners. He kept the lamp on, as if that small glow could hold them back. The next morning Josh stood at his bathroom mirror, staring at the reflection that didn't quite feel like his own. His face was pale, eyes rimmed in red, but there was something else, a faint flicker at the edges of his vision, like shadows dancing where they shouldn't be. He spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to ground himself, but the sensation of being watched never left. Desperate for clarity, Josh drove back to town, hoping the familiarity of crowds and noise might shake the forest from his mind. But as he sat in the diner, watching people laugh, eat, talk, he felt disconnected, like he was watching a world he no longer belonged to. The smell of coffee, the clatter of plates, all seemed distant, muffled. When a waitress asked if he was all right, he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He left half his meal untouched. He thought about telling someone, reaching out for help, but how could he explain it? That he felt the forest watching him, even now. That he heard whispers in the dead of night, murmurs threading through the static of his thoughts. No one would believe him. He barely believed himself. That night, as the wind howled outside, the whispers returned clearer this time, less like words and more like laughter. Josh sat upright in bed, every light in the house turned on, but the shadows still danced. They crept beneath the door frames, stretched long against the walls, rippling in places where the light should have chased them away. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound came from inside. By the third night, Josh stopped turning the lights off altogether. His house glowed like a beacon in the dark, but it didn't stop the nightmares. Every dream returned him to the clearing, the ring of stones, the flickering figure of Mara standing too still, head tilting unnaturally. He'd wake with the taste of dirt in his mouth, the echo of her voice calling him back. Come back. On the fourth day, his phone rang. It was Mara's sister, asking if they'd made it home safe if she'd heard from Mara. Josh's throat tightened. He lied, saying Mara had decided to stay a few extra days with friends. His voice cracked, but he forced the lie out, knowing the truth was impossible. When he hung up, the guilt twisted in his stomach, but the fear twisted harder. If he spoke the truth, the forest might hear him. And somehow, he knew it wouldn't like that. The forest wasn't finished with him yet. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows stretched long across his living room, the soft hum of a heartbeat returned beneath the floorboards. Josh pressed his hands to the wood, feeling the steady thud pulsing through the house. The forest was still with him, and deep down, he knew he would have to go back. By the fifth night, Josh's home no longer felt like his own. The walls seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the forest's heartbeat, the shadows clinging tighter, darker, even beneath the artificial glow of the lights. He heard scratching now inside the walls, under the floor soft at first, then more frantic, clawing, as if something trapped beneath the wood was desperate to get out. When he pressed his ear to the floor, the scratching paused, and then came a breath, hot against his skin from beneath the boards. His blood ran cold. Sleep became impossible. When his eyelids sagged from exhaustion, the dreams came sharper, more vivid. No longer just the clearing or Mara's twisted grin, but something worse. He saw himself standing at the center of that ring of stones, eyes hollow, mouth stitched shut, roots growing up from the soil, weaving into his flesh, anchoring him there. He felt the tug of those roots, even after waking, phantom pain lacing his arms and legs. That night, the whispering didn't come from outside or beneath him, it came from within his own head. The voices spoke softly at first, murmuring nonsense, overlapping one another, until one rose above the rest. Mara's voice, calm, steady, almost kind. Let it in, Josh. It's easier that way. He staggered to the bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection as the voices hissed beneath her words. And for just a moment his reflection smiled back, the grin too wide for his face. Panic overwhelmed him. He stumbled back, heart racing, the pressure in his skull building until he could barely hear anything else. The walls seemed to close in, the room spinning. From the corner of his vision, shapes moved, dark figures, flickering like flame, always at the edge of sight. They crowded the edges of the room, inching closer every time he blinked. As the clock ticked past midnight, the house trembled. Not from wind or storm, but something deeper. The heartbeat beneath the floor grew louder, matching his racing pulse, each thud rattling the windows, shaking the lights overhead. The scratching returned fierce, furious. This time, it wasn't trying to get out. It was trying to come in. Josh collapsed to the floor, clutching his head as the pounding in his skull grew unbearable. The voices inside multiplying, overlapping, screaming. They spoke in languages he couldn't understand, layered whispers that grated against his sanity. His vision blurred, the edges of the room twisting, warping walls stretching unnaturally tall, doorways narrowing like hungry mouths. In the flickering overhead light, the shadows stretched long, twisting into hands that reached toward him, clawing through the air, curling toward his chest. He scrambled backward, pressing against the cold wall, but the shadows kept creeping closer. Fingers thin and spindly, merging with the floor beneath him, they clawed at his ankles, holding him still. The walls cracked, deep black veins splitting the paint, leaking dark sap that smelled of damp earth and rot. Josh's breath came in short gasps as the room itself seemed to lean inward, pressing against him, the space tightening with every heartbeat. And the whispers inside his skull began chanting one word, over and over, louder than before: return. The floor beneath him buckled with a violent tremor, spitting apart, revealing a gaping Voidan endless pit, its walls slick with pulsing roots and shifting faces. He saw Mara's face again, twisted, her mouth moving in slow, jerking patterns as if she were trying to scream but couldn't. Other faces flickered past countless others' mouths agape, eyes hollow, their hands reaching up from the dark pit as if begging to be freed. The heartbeat roared in his ears, drowning out his thoughts, anchoring him to the spot. He couldn't breathe. The pit wanted him. As the shadows tightened their grip, dragging him closer to the edge, Josh fought back with a desperate primal scream. His fingernails tore against the wooden floor, leaving deep gouges, splinters embedding into his skin, blood smearing in frantic lines. But the pool from beneath grew stronger, the voices now screaming in unison, chanting in a deafening rhythm that echoed through his bones. Every inch he resisted felt like a lifetime lost, the void beneath yawning wider, ready to consume. Just as his body teetered at the edge, the floorboards slammed back together with a thunderous crack, throwing him back against the wall. The voices fell silent, the shadows recoiled. But Josh sat frozen, shaking, the echo of the chanting still vibrating beneath his skin. The forest wasn't done with him, it was just waiting for the right moment to drag him back for good. Josh lay there for what felt like hours, his chest heaving, the room silent once again, but the pressure in the air still unbearable. His hands shook violently, smeared with blood from the gouges he'd clawed into the floor. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, mocking him with its normalcy. But outside the windows, the night pressed against the glass like a living thing, thick and unmoving, the shadows frozen but watching. Every nerve in his body screamed to run, but he knew there was nowhere to go. When he finally stood, his knees buckled beneath him, forcing him to grip the edge of the kitchen counter to steady himself. He stared at the phone on the wall, contemplating dialing someone, anyone but. What could he say? The forest had followed him home. His house was alive. They'd lock him away before they believed a word. And somehow, deep inside, he knew speaking about it aloud would make it stronger. The lights in the house flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. Darkness swallowed the space, leaving only the faint glow of the outside streetlights bleeding through the curtains. But even that felt distant, as though the house had shifted somewhere else. The whispering resumed closer, sharper, like breath against the back of his neck. Josh pressed his back against the wall, scanning the dark, eyes wide, searching for the shapes he knew were there. A low, scraping sound echoed from the hallway, slow, purposeful, like nails dragging along the walls, inching toward him. His throat closed up, heart hammering as he stared down the corridor. And there, half glimpsed in the flickering darker shadow, dragged itself along the floor, its limbs bending wrong, its movements jerking, unnatural. He stumbled back into the living room, eyes darting to the front door. Considering flight, but he froze. The door was gone. Where it had once been, there was now only smooth wall, pulsing faintly as if breathing. His skin crawled. The forest wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. Josh screamed, pounding on the wall where the door had been, fists leaving dents, but the wall remained solid, unyielding. The scraping sound grew louder, dragging closer. He turned, eyes frantic, scanning for another exit, but the windows had vanished two smooth, seamless walls where they had once been. His home had become the clearing. The heartbeat returned, thudding beneath the floor, vibrating up through his feet. His breath hitched as the shadows in the corners thickened, coiling upward, merging into a figure tall, hooded, faceless. The same figure that had waited at the edge of the clearing, always watching, its head tilted, body flickering at the edges like smoke. The figure raised a hand slowly, pointing downward toward the floor beneath Josh's feet. The ground vibrated violently, cracking apart in jagged lines, revealing once again that endless pit. From its depths came the sounds of scraping claws, whispering voices, the echo of Mara's scream caught somewhere between the worlds. He dropped to his knees, hands covering his ears, shaking his head, willing it all to stop, but the shadows only moved closer, the figure looming tall over him. The house groaned, the walls warping, bending inward, pressing closer as though trying to squeeze the air from the room. His body trembled, the pressure in his chest unbearable. And then the figure spoke not aloud, but directly into his mind. "You never left." Josh's eyes widened, horror flooding him as the truth settled in. He hadn't escaped the forest. He brought it with him. The shadows parted, just enough for a new figure to step through, a silhouette emerging from the void, like a memory made flesh. Josh's breath caught in his throat as Mara stood before him, eyes wide, skin pale as frost, her clothes damp and torn from the night she vanished. Her expression was blank, unreadable, but her mouth moved, forming a whisper only he could hear. "You left me there." The words were calm, but her voice cracked like old wood. He scrambled backward on the floor, heart racing, eyes locked on her. "Mara?" he croaked, barely able to speak her name. She stepped closer, bare feet making no sound on the warped wood, her head tilting slightly too far as if her neck no longer understood its limits. Her hands hung at her sides, twitching gently, like she wasn't in control of them. The same smile that haunted his dreams slowly stretched across her face. "I tried to follow you," she said. Her voice layered hers, but beneath it, something else. Something deeper, but it wouldn't let me. Tears streamed down Josh's face as she knelt beside him, her hand reaching out, trembling, stopping just shy of his cheek. "You didn't come back for me," she whispered, and as her fingers touched his skin, they burned ice-cold like the roots of the forest had sunk into her bones. He wanted to explain, to scream that he had tried, that he'd never stopped hearing her voice, but the words caught in his throat. Mara leaned in closer, her eyes now filled with blackness, swallowing the whites whole. "Now you don't have to leave me again," she said softly, almost lovingly, as the shadows surged forward, wrapping around them both like a cocoon. The last thing Josh saw before darkness took him was Mara's smile stretching impossibly wide, welcoming him home. From the suffocating darkness, a sudden howl cut through the void-long, mournful and wild. The shadows recoiled, putting back just enough for Josh to catch a glimpse of yellow eyes gleaming from the blackness. A wolf, massive and ragged, its fur streaked with grey and matted with earth, stepped into the clearing of his mind. Its gaze locked onto Mara, the smile still frozen on her unnatural face, and for the first time the figure of Mara trembled. The wolf growled, low and rumbling, a sound that seemed to shake the ground beneath Josh's knees. The shadows wavered, faltering at the beast's presence. The wolf took a deliberate step forward, baring its teeth at Mara as though it recognized the thing inside her. Mara's black eyes narrowed, her smile fading for the first time, and she hissed a sound no human should make. But the wolf didn't back down. Its eyes burned brighter, a flicker of something ancient, something older than the forest's hunger. With a sudden lunge, the wolf leapt at Mara, jaws snapping, shadows exploding around them like smoke. Josh's vision blurred, the darkness unraveling as the wolf collided with the twisted image of the woman he'd lost. For a moment, the heartbeat stopped, the world holding its breath. And then the shadows shattered, the forest's grip breaking, leaving only Josh, alone on the floor of his home, gasping for air beneath the faint echo of a distant fading howl. Josh lay still, gasping, his chest heaving as if he'd run miles, the echo of the wolf's howl lingering in the air long after the shadows had fled. His house stood quiet again, the walls no longer pulsing, the floor solid beneath him. But the silence felt hollow, stretched thin, like a fragile skin over something still waiting beneath. He pushed himself upright, his limbs trembling, eyes darting toward every corner, half expecting the shadows to return. Yet, for the first time in nights, they didn't. But the wolf's eyes haunted him just as fiercely as the shadows did those yellow orbs burning through the dark, primal, ancient. He didn't know if it was real or some fragment of his mind fighting back against the forest's grip. Either way, something had saved him. He crawled to the window, pulling back the curtain with trembling hands, half expecting the trees of Black Hollow to be standing outside. Instead, the world beyond his home looked normal too normal. The streetlights hummed softly, cars parked in their places, the world still turning. As dawn crept in, washing his home in pale light, Josh forced himself to stand. His reflection caught him in the hallway, mirror eyes bloodshot, face pale and gaunt, thinner than he remembered. But worse, just beneath the surface of the glass, the faintest shape flickered. A shadow, watching. He spun, but nothing was there. The house was still, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. Driven by something he couldn't quite name, Josh grabbed his coat and keys and left the house, the cool morning air burning his lungs as he stepped outside. He walked without a plan, without direction, his feet pulling him toward the edge of town, toward the trailhead, toward Black Hollow. His mind screamed at him to turn back, but something deeper, some thread the forest still held, kept tugging him closer. At the border of the woods, Josh stopped, staring into the endless wall of trees, the rising sun barely piercing their depths. His hands clenched into fists as he heard it again, a distant, low growl from within the forest. The wolf was still there, waiting, watching, and though the forest's grip had weakened, he knew the story wasn't over. Something inside those trees was unfinished. Josh stood at the edge of the trail, his breath misting in the morning air, heart pounding louder with each step closer to the tree line. The forest loomed, just as it had before, silent, unmoving, but now he could feel its eyes on him, a presence behind every branch, beneath every root. His feet felt heavy, as though the soil itself resisted him, warning him not to return. But the pull was stronger. A quiet demand whispered beneath his skin, beneath the earth, telling him, but it wasn't done with him yet. As he stepped into the shade of the first trees, the temperature dropped sharply, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. His boots crunched softly over fallen leaves, and with every step, the world outside faded behind him. It felt as though he was stepping into a different time, a place that remembered what had happened and was ready to continue. Somewhere in the distance, a familiar rustling stirred branches, shifting not from wind, but from movement. And then, far ahead, the soft glow of Ayazet-2, burning yellow orbs, watching from between the trees. The wolf stood there, half shrouded in mist, its gaze locked onto Josh, unblinking. It didn't growl this time. It simply watched, as if waiting for him to follow. Josh's pulse quickened. He took a cautious step forward, his instincts screaming in protest, but something deeper urged him on. The wolf turned slowly, disappearing into the mist, leading him down a narrow, winding path. Deeper into the woods, the light faded, the trees pressing closer together, their branches tangled like veins. The ground beneath his feet softened, each step sinking slightly, as if the forest remembered him. And there, up ahead the clearing, the ring of stones sat undisturbed, perfect, like no time had passed at all. But this time, something lay at its center, Mara's scarf, neatly folded, untouched by dirt or time. The wolf stood just outside the circle, its yellow eyes never leaving Josh. The silence pressed in heavier now, the heartbeat beneath the ground faint but steady. Josh's throat tightened as he stepped closer to the ring, the weight of the forest pressing against his chest. The shadows hadn't returned yet, but he could feel them, waiting. The wolf growled softly, a warning or perhaps an invitation to face what still lingered beneath the soil. Josh knelt at the edge of the stone circle, his fingers trembling as he reached for Mara's scarf. The fabric was soft, clean, far too clean for something left in the elements. His breath hitched as he lifted it, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the heartbeat beneath the ground growing louder with each second. The wolf growled again, deeper this time, its eyes narrowing as if it sensed what lay beneath the soil was beginning to stir. Josh stood, clutching the scarf to his chest, feeling the air grow colder. A sudden wind whipped through the clearing, scattering leaves, rattling the stones. From the trees surrounding him, shadows stretched long, creeping toward the circle like fingers. The forest began to whisper again, the voices layering, filling the space between the trees and his skin. They were no longer gentle, they hissed and snarled, demanding, reminding him that he belonged here now. Josh took a shaky step back, but the shadows closed in tighter, curling just beyond the stones. The wolf stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the circle, its fur bristling, teeth bared at the encroaching dark. It circled Josh slowly, eyes flickering between him and the approaching shadows, its body tense, prepared to fight. Josh felt the weight of the forest's attention, every branch, every root focused on him, waiting for him to move, to falter. The earth beneath the circle pulsed once, hard enough to make him stagger. Then, from the shadows, Mara emerged. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow black pits, but her movements were smoother now, more controlled. She stepped into the clearing, her gaze locked on Josh, lips parting in a smile that sent a chill down his spine. "You came back," she whispered, but the voice wasn't Herzet, was deeper, layered with 1,000 others. The ground vibrated beneath his feet, the circle of stones glowing faintly as if reacting to her presence. Josh's grip on the scarf tightened, his breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. The wolf stood between him and Mara now, its growl low and steady, holding the shadows at bay. Mara's head tilted, her smile widening, as the whispers grew louder, deafening. "You can't leave this time," she said, stepping closer, her form flickering like smoke, unraveling at the edges. Josh's heart raced as he realized the truth: the forest wasn't going to let him leave again.